Hi everybody, I am Kaye Estoconing, and today we're going to talk about poverty. We're also going to talk about social inequality and social stratification. First, we have to include the idea of rich and poor, and moving forward to some major theories of poverty that sociologists use. So, what is poverty, the types of poverty, and how poverty impacts our society? Because it does. So here are the terms, and make sure that you have taken down note of those. Now let's get into our content. So first, let's go define what is poverty. So poverty, the first thing that we have to do is to find out what is it. It is a standard of living below the minimum level considered adequate by society. So the minimum that you need to survive, it's either you won't have a proper food, you don't have a proper housing, or perhaps don't have a proper medical care. If you can't afford those basic standards of living, then you are considered in poverty. However, that differs from country to country. So poverty differs from the poverty level. So there is this line, which is the annual income need for a family to survive. If you cannot meet that income level, then you are below the poverty line. If you can, then you're above the poverty line. Now, how do they determine whether you're above or below the poverty line? So it's the minimal nutritional diet cost times 3. So if you need to eat certain kinds of fruits and grains and proteins, how much would that cost? Multiply that by 3, that's the poverty level. The current official poverty threshold in the Philippines is 10,481 pesos, which is the minimal amount of a family of 5 needs in a month to buy their basic food and non-food items. So if your family income is higher than that, then in the poverty threshold, then the government doesn't consider you poor. Basically, there are two types of poverty, the absolute and the relative poverty. People in absolute poverty lack basic necessities like a roof over their head, food, and water. They're only focused on surviving each day, while relative poverty, on the other hand, is relative to the average standards of person in a person's society. What is considered high income in one country could be considered middle or low class. There are two indicators of relative poverty, and it's the capital income and the national income. For policymaking and public service purposes, the Philippine government look in the per capita income in relation to the poverty threshold to classify the income level of each citizen and to assess their standards of living. We are going into the sociological theories of poverty that sociologists use to understand the poverty. To begin with the conflict theory by Karl Marx. He remembered as a father of divisive political movement during the 19th century, understanding that we can elaborate and expand with this with more contemporary theories, but just a foundation. Marx theorized the capitalist, or whom he called the bourgeoisie, owns the means of production, and means of production is anything that generates a value. Marx contrasts the capitalist or the bourgeoisie with the worker whom he called the proletarian. A proletarian or a worker is anyone that sells their labor for wages. It is obvious for Marx how labor directly benefits the capitalist, right? People working for you to create a value. They don't get it. They create a value that you can skim off to make a profit. For Marx, condition of poverty directly benefits the capitalist. This means that exploiting the workers by not giving the fulfillment on what they create and what they produce. For Marx, poverty drives people to work. It forces them to accept working conditions and levels of play that they would otherwise find unacceptable. For Marx, workers will eventually develop class consciousness. which is the awareness of our own exploitation. And then we will revolt against the capitalist class. For Marx, this is the natural conclusion of capitalism, is that workers will eventually realize that being exploited and get sick of being exploited and work together to own the means of production. Structural functionalism is also another theory that sociologists use to understand poverty. It has been proposed by Emile Durkheim. He says that wealthy people control both the means of production, but also they can also accumulate and consolidate wealth through the ownership of goods. Classes in societies cannot neatly divided into those who controls the means of production and those who work for wages. Because of course, we considered some wage workers to be wealthy. The capitalist structural functionalists would say that poverty benefits society. A more contemporary structural functionalist, for example, David and Monroe, argue that poverty and wealth inequality in general is necessary for a productive division of labor in society. If we are to a society that functions smoothly, we need people who are willing to do unpleasant jobs. We need people who are willing to collect the garbage and work in the recycling centers. We need people who are willing to scrub the floors and the toilets. Durkheim says, as functional, who would do that work? For Durkheim and other structural functionalists, poverty is not necessary as dysfunction. It's not necessary as society is falling. It may be a necessary part of society's functioning, the way we need it to function. When we talk about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, so in order for us to really understand Weber's contribution, Weber was a German. Weber was a student of Marx in that he studied Marx. He said that in order to really understand the Industrial Revolution and the capitalism system that emerged from it, it's really necessary to understand Protestant Christianity. Catholicism is also very critical of exploiting work and kind of voluntarism and critical of having uncharitable attitude towards the poor. Those who got rich, the Puritan thought, must have been chosen by God for heaven. Those who were poor were damned. So if you're poor, you must have done something wrong. You must not be working hard or saving responsibility. You must be sin and God is punishing you. So we have this moral judgment. We also have this idea from the biblical narrative and from the Protestant philosophy and theology. Deserving versus the undeserving poor. So the deserving poor are those who through catastrophe or facing kinds of temporary poverty. So maybe an 80 years old person without blindness would be an example of deserving poor. We can't expect an 80 years old person who doesn't see well to get most job right. So they may be in poverty, though it's not their fault in their own. That person is deserving of our pity and deserving of our acceptance. So that's why he considered as deserving poor. Whereas the undeserving poor or who do in their own choices or their own doing. A common example for this is someone who has an addiction, isn't able to hold down, or someone who do something unprofitable. When we say this, we may see these persons as undeserving. A lot of setter of colonialism was perpetuated under this kind of narrative. We're bringing these people in enlightenment, not just religious enlightenment, but also economic enlightenment. We're enlightening these people, or perhaps these cultures, to the way of the capitalists. We have this idea, most famously argued by William Julius Wilson, the culture of poverty theory. Sociology is a balance between structure and agency. So the structure refers to social forces, social institutions, and social circumstances that shapes our lives. Agency refers to our own ability to do something about our lives. So structures might that I'm born in a poor rural area with a bad school system. That may tend to prevent me getting ahead economically, but the agency is my ability to study hard, pursue scholarships, and try my best. William argued in the side of agency that structures play an important role in people's economic circumstances, but that people also have the agency to make their own choices. He argued that conditions of deprivation shape people's mindset and behavior, and that poverty is reinforced and reproduced through individual choices. And also, this happens on a cultural level. He is particularly talking about the inner city, poverty areas of concentrated economic deprivation. So he's talking about those people who grew up in a very poor neighborhoods and the inner city where most of the people around them are poor and where it's very difficult to envision alternatives. Imagine that your school is so underfunded, so under-resourced, and so underconnected that nobody who graduates ahead of you has gotten a college degree or has gotten a highly paid job. Everybody just kind of either drop out or finish and stays in the neighborhood and flounders around it, a low paying job. If that's the case, why would you try hard in school? If you understand that your efforts are unlikely to be rewarded toward education, why would you try hard in school? William said that when you have concentrated poverty, you have conditions that are demotivating and that limit people's abilities to make good choices. Mothers who live in a condition of poverty may choose to parent on their own, and it may be that they feel ill equipped to accomplish a successful marriage or aren't fulfilled. To avoid this kind of scenario, that's why some people are in favor of parenting on their own. If you are parenting on condition of poverty, you may not be able to promise your child economic security. You may not be able to promise your child a secure future. What you can do is to give them a happy in a short term. As our culture is shaped by circumstances, that culture image based on social structure. But then, culture shapes behavior. And this culture of poverty keeps people in poverty over and over, generation after generation, and it becomes a mindset rather just a collection of circumstances. So that you can change these circumstances. But if you don't change that mindset, people will people will raise their children in mindsets of poverty and will continue to reproduce poverty. That's all for today, and thank you.